Do we have reason to believe that Jesus of Nazareth existed? And do we have evidence for his existence outside the Bible itself? Those are the questions that we're going to address in this video. If this is your first time watching, my name is Ryan Leisure. I'm a pastor and PhD student. Well, in recent decades, an increasing number of people have been propagating the view that Jesus was a myth, that he was made up, and that Christianity drew its inspiration from other ancient religious myths from the broader Greco-Roman world. The problem with this view, though, is that it fails to grapple with the actual evidence. It tosses out all the New Testament texts and treats them like fictitious documents. It ignores the fact that the New Testament documents were simply first century sources that told about a recent figure from the recent past. Just because these documents were later collected and compiled into the New Testament canon doesn't mean they weren't good historical sources. In fact, to have 27 first century sources, all testifying to a figure from the first century, is overwhelming evidence. Not to mention all the late first century and early second century Christian sources that came from the associates of the disciples as well. Now, if we had this plethora of evidence for any other figure in antiquity, it would be seen as incredible evidence for that person's existence. But since it's Jesus that we're talking about, skeptics just find it unsatisfactory. Furthermore, the mythicist view also fails to grapple with the fact that the Gospels fall under the category of ancient Greco-Roman biography, which was a common genre in the ancient world that told the story of an actual person doing real things from the recent past. Ancient biographies did not tell stories about made-up figures. They report on people like Julius Caesar, Nero, Cicero, and Cato. There was such a thing as an ancient novel or epic that told fictitious stories. So if the early Christians intended to tell a mythical story, they could have used one of those genres, but they didn't. I recently made a video demonstrating that the Gospels belong to the genre of ancient biography, and I've put a link to it in the description notes below, and I would encourage you to go check that out for yourself. This video, though, is going to explore the evidence for Jesus outside the Bible from non-Christian sources. The reason being is because skeptics oftentimes accuse Christian writers of being biased and therefore untrustworthy. Now, I think we should reject that argument for at least two reasons. First, it assumes that perfectly objective people exist that have no bias. Nothing, though, could be farther from the truth. Everyone has a bias. Everyone has a presupposition, Christian and non-Christian alike. Jesus mythicists have a bias, and that bias is oftentimes revealed in the fact that they reject the overwhelming evidence for the existence of Jesus. Evidence that basically every scholar of ancient history and Christianity finds compelling, whether they are Christian or not. Bart Ehrman, for example, a notable skeptic of Christianity, finds the Jesus mythicist view utterly ridiculous. He claims that mythicist views are sensationalist, so extravagant, so wrong-headed, and so poorly substantiated that it is no wonder that scholars do not take them seriously. He elsewhere asserts, "It is fair to say that mythicists as a group and as individuals are not taken seriously by the vast majority of scholars in the field of New Testament, early Christianity, ancient history, and theology. This is widely recognized to their chagrin by mythicists themselves." And he also notes, "Of the thousands of scholars of early Christianity who teach at major or minor accredited colleges, universities, and seminaries, none of them, he says, to my knowledge, has any doubt that Jesus existed." In other words, the Jesus mythicist movement is largely driven by internet skeptics, not certified historians or academics. All that to say, mythicists often critique the Christian sources for being biased when their own extreme views reveal a bias of their own. When a popular skeptic, such as Bart Ehrman, is saying that a view is too skeptical, well, that's saying something. Any sensible historian can see that Jesus existed. Only a certain ideological position could lead someone to say that Jesus was a made up person. But should we reject someone's view because of their bias? Well, no, because, as I said, everyone has a bias. I have a bias, and so do you. Now, certainly it's helpful to know someone's bias when we are reading them or listening to them, but ultimately, evaluating the evidence of their claims is the most important thing. Of course, early Christian writers are going to be biased when they write about Jesus. After all, they believe he is the risen Lord and Savior of the world. Is it really reasonable to think that Paul would be unbiased when writing about Jesus? Imagine if Paul, who claims to have encountered the risen Jesus, said something like this in his letters. Yeah, I think Jesus probably rose from the dead and that he is the Son of God, but that's just my take on things. Feel free to believe whatever you like. I could be wrong. Now, that would be ridiculous. Christians believe that Jesus is the risen Lord and Savior of the world. Of course, they're going to propagate the news and seek to convert people to Christianity. All Christians, if they are truly committed to Jesus, are going to be biased. They believe it is the best news in the world, and they think everyone needs to know it. Now, another reason to reject the so-called biased argument is because, well, oftentimes it's the people who are the most biased who end up being the best sources because they are the ones who are most invested in what has happened. Consider, for example, the Jews from the Holocaust. Our best sources from those concentration camps are Jews. Now, do you think that they had a bias against the German Nazis? Well, you bet they did. But does that mean they aren't the best sources that tell us what it was really like in those concentration camps? Well, of course not. In fact, I would argue that the exact opposite is true. Those who are personally involved and impacted by the events are typically the ones who are the most motivated to get the message out because they want the entire world to know what has happened. Well, the same goes for early Christian writers. These were the people who were most invested in the story of Jesus because Jesus had significantly impacted their lives, and they believed that it had significant implications for everyone else too. They walked with him, they talked with him, they heard his teachings, they observed his miracles, they saw him get crucified, and they saw him alive afterwards. Of all the people, these are the ones who are going to give us the best account of Jesus. Now, I'm not going to look to some outsider to give me the best info on Jesus. I'm going to look to his inner circle of followers for that. So, with that said, we do have a dozen or so non-Christian sources from within a century or so of Jesus' death that talk about him. And while these sources don't give us nearly the information on Jesus that we get from Christian writings, particularly the New Testament documents, they still provide us with some corroborating evidence for Jesus. So, in the remaining portion of this video, I'm going to highlight 7 of those sources. Certainly, some of these sources are better than others, but all of them refer to Jesus in one way or another. So let's begin with our first source, and that is Tacitus. Cornelius Tacitus was born in the year 56, and he died in the year 118. He served as proconsul of Asia in the years 112 and 113, and he was the son-in-law of the British governor Agricola, and he also was the author of 2 large historical works called the Annals and Histories that covered the history of Rome from the time of Julius Caesar up through his day in the 2nd century. He lived through 10 Roman emperors and is widely considered by many to be the greatest of all ancient Roman historians. Now, unfortunately, much of his work has been lost to us, though some of it still survives. And one such surviving piece of information mentions Christ. Consider this excerpt from the early 2nd century. He writes, "Consequently, to get rid of the report Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle and was exhibiting a show in the circus, while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car. Hence, even for criminals who deserved extreme and exemplary punishment, there arose a feeling of compassion, for it was not, as it seemed, for the public good, but to glut one man's cruelty that they were being destroyed. Now, what can we learn here from Tacitus? Well, 1, Christians are named after their founder, Christus, which is a Latinized version of Christ's name. 2, Christ was killed during the reign of the Emperor Tiberius. 3, Pontius Pilatus, the procurator of Judea, was the one responsible for putting Jesus to death. We know from elsewhere that Pilate held this position between the years 26 and 36. So, Jesus' death must have occurred in that 10-year window. 4, the mischievous superstition held by Christians was checked for a moment after Jesus' death, but then it broke out again, not just in Judea, where the evil superstition originated, but it came even all the way to Rome itself. Now, this statement appears to be an indirect reference to the belief of the early Christians that Jesus had, in fact, risen from the grave. 5, Christians were arrested and then tortured to death by Nero. In fact, he blamed them for the fire of Rome, as the text suggests. 6, the torture got so bad that even the Romans started to feel bad that the Christians were being unjustly treated. Now, Tacitus clearly believed that Jesus existed and was killed under the direction of Pontius Pilate. Now, to get around this, Jesus' mythicists will typically claim one of two things. Either this passage was a later Christian interpolation of the text, or Tacitus just didn't know what he was talking about when he wrote this and was merely passing along Christian hearsay. Yet, both of these claims should be rejected. First, there is no evidence that this passage was not original to Tacitus's text. For starters, we don't have any manuscript evidence to suggest that it wasn't original, meaning there's not one single manuscript of Tacitus's writings where this passage is missing. So the mythicist claim here has no evidence. Also, if this were a later Christian interpolation, it's quite strange that Christians would say that they were a class hated by the populace for their abominations, that they held to a most mischievous superstition, that their movement was evil, hideous, and shameful, and that they were guilty of hatred against mankind, and that they deserved extreme and exemplary punishment. Whoever wrote this passage was clearly not a Christian. It's also strange that if a Christian wrote this passage, they didn't make Christ's resurrection more explicit. It hints to it, but it doesn't spell it out like one might expect. So the later Christian interpolation theory ought to be rejected. We should also reject the notion that Tacitus didn't know what he was talking about and was merely passing along Christian hearsay. Tacitus was not the type of historian who would report events without reliable sources. After all, he held high positions in the Roman government and had access to official Roman government archives. something that he cites multiple times throughout his work. Thus, it seems far more reasonable to think a historian of the quality of Tacitus got his information on the crucifixion from official Roman archives rather than just Christian hearsay. It's hard to believe that Tacitus would implicate a Roman official such as Pilate without hard evidence to support his claims. And it's also important to bear in mind that Tacitus clearly had a low view of Christians. Why would he rely on the testimony of a group that he called a mischievous superstition while writing his history on Rome? At minimum, if he were relying on hearsay from Christians, he would have couched this passage by saying something like, Christians report that these things happened. Now, a second source we'll consider is Josephus, a Jewish historian writing late in the 1st century. Flavius Josephus was born in the year 37 and died right around the year 100. He was born into a Jewish priestly class. He became a Pharisee, and eventually he served as a commander of the Jewish forces in Galilee during the Jewish war against the Romans. During the war, he was captured by the Romans, but eventually fell into the good graces of Vespasian, based upon his predictions that Vespasian would become the next emperor. Now, Josephus went on to write a great deal about the history of Israel, which he later presented to the emperor. And much of what we know about 1st century Palestine comes from him. Now, throughout his writing, Josephus refers to Jesus in 2 separate passages. The first passage, as we'll see, is highly disputed, but the second one is not. The first passage is commonly known as the Flavianum Testimonium, and it goes like this. Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as receive the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive on the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct at this day. You'll notice the underlined phrases in this quote. Just about every scholar agrees that a Jew like Josephus would have never made these claims. If he truly believed that Jesus wasn't just a man, or that he was the Christ, well, he would have become a Christian. If he truly believed in the resurrection, he would have become a Christian. So it does appear as if this passage has been doctored. And it must have been doctored prior to the end of the 3rd century, since Eusebius quotes this passage in full, with the interpolations around the year 325. That said, a majority of Josephus scholars believe that the bulk of this passage, the parts not underlined, are authentic, and they go back to Josephus. And this is supported by the fact that we don't possess any manuscripts that lack this passage altogether. It's also interesting to note that about 50 years ago, there was a discovery of an Arabic translation of Josephus that contains the bulk of this passage, but is missing the more explicit Christian references. While the manuscript is dated to around the 10th century, it appears to go back to an earlier stage before the text had been doctored. The Arabic translation reads, "At this time there was a wise man who was called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion, and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders." Okay, so what can we learn about Jesus from this passage? 1, Jesus was considered a wise teacher. 2, he was known as a doer of wonderful works. This appears to be an implicit claim to the fact that Jesus was known as a miracle worker. 3, he had many followers among both Jews and Gentiles. 4, he was handed over to be killed by Jewish authorities. 5, he was crucified under the direction of Pontius Pilate. 6, even though Jesus was killed, his followers remained loyal to him. This loyalty after death was certainly unusual in ancient Judaism. After all, there were several pretend messiahs in ancient Israel that were killed by the Romans. Never once, though, did that movement continue on after their deaths. When the would be Messiah died, people went and found a new Messiah. But not so with Jesus. Something different happened after his death. And 7, the Christian movement continued on until the time of Josephus at the end of the 1st century. Now on to the second passage. Here, Josephus writes, "When therefore Ananus thought he had now a proper opportunity, he assembled the Sanhedrin of judges and brought before them the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. And when he had formed an accusation against them as breakers of the law, he delivered them to be stoned." The context of this passage notes that Ananus, a Sadducee and high priest, seized the opportunity to put James to death while no Roman procurator was in Judea. The governor Festus, who is mentioned in Acts, had just died, and the emperor had replaced him with Albinus. But before Albinus could arrive, Ananus jumped at the opportunity to put James and others to death. The text goes on to say how this action displeased the people of Jerusalem, who then issued a complaint. When Albinus heard about what Ananus had done, he wrote him a letter and threatened him with punishment, and Ananus was removed from his position shortly thereafter. Now, unlike the previous passage, Edwin Yamauchi writes, "Few scholars have questioned the genuineness of this passage." Now notice that Josephus reports in this passage that Jesus was called the Christ, and that he had a brother named James, who was stoned to death by the Jewish officials just a few decades previously. Now, I'm no biologist, but it seems to me that if someone had a brother who was recently killed, that someone must be a real person, not a mythical figure. Josephus corroborates the biblical account, which lists James as the brother of Jesus, who had become a prominent figure in Jerusalem. This passage is also more modest than the previous one, which blatantly declared that Jesus was the Christ. Here it just says that he was called the Christ. That sounds like something a Jewish historian might say. Now, with respect to this passage, Craig Evans argues that it supports the existence of the Flavianum Testimonium, the first passage, given that it identifies James as the brother of Jesus, who is called the Christ. Evans writes, "The authenticity of the second, shorter passage lends support to the authenticity of the earlier passage. The reference to Jesus, the one called Christ, clearly implies a prior reference. In all probability, the testimonium is that prior reference. It's as if Josephus assumes that his readers will already be familiar with Jesus, who is called the Christ, which is why he identifies James with him. Given that he provides no additional details about this Jesus character, it's safe to assume that Josephus has already described him earlier in the work. Otherwise, associating James with Jesus called the Christ would not have any meaning to the readers unless they had already read about him. Or, it's possible, Josephus just assumes his readers will have already heard about this Jesus who's called the Christ. Either way, the quote assumes a prior knowledge of Jesus, which contradicts all of the mythicist views. Now, a third source we'll consider is Pliny the Younger. Pliny was born in the year 61 and died sometime before the year 120. He also served as governor of Bithynia, which is in modern-day Turkey, from the years 109 to 111. Pliny was bothered by the fact that the overwhelming Christian influence in his area had led to the pagan temples being deserted, a decrease in attendance at pagan festivals, and that fewer sacrificial animals were being purchased. So Pliny dealt harshly with Christians that were handed over to him. He interrogated them, inquiring from them if they were indeed Christians. If they answered yes, he would ask them again under the threat of death. And if they persisted, he would have them executed. Occasionally, he would torture them to obtain information, as he did with 2 female slaves who were called deaconesses in the church. And if they denied being Christians or had disavowed their faith, he would require them to curse Christ in front of him before he would release them. Well, around the year 110, he wrote a letter to the Emperor Trajan seeking advice on how to handle the situation better. In the letter, he describes the Christians as follows. They were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light, when they sang in alternate verses a hymn to Christ, as to a god, and bound themselves by a solemn oath, not to deny any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, or adultery, never to falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up, after which it was their custom to separate, and then reassemble to partake of food, but food of an ordinary and innocent kind. Here we learn a few important facts from Pliny. First, we see that Christians gathered on a fixed day in the early morning, probably a reference to Sunday morning. Two, we see that these Christians sang songs to Christ as if to a god. This phrase suggests that Pliny knew Christ to be a human being, and so he found it strange that they would worship him as if he were a god. Three, we see that the Christians were committed to abiding by certain ethical norms. This probably refers to their commitment to keeping the commands of Scripture. And fourth, we see that they would reassemble later, probably at evening, when they would eat food of an ordinary and innocent kind. This is most likely a reference to the weekly love feast and Eucharist. Now, the way Pliny phrases it suggests that he expected to find something sinister in their food. After all, there were rumors that Christians were cannibals based upon their language of eating the body and drinking the blood of Christ. Pliny discovered, though, that it was just normal food. Now, a fourth source is the Jewish Mishnah and Talmud, the central text of rabbinical Judaism, which contains the teachings of thousands of rabbis. While there are a few passages in the Talmud that probably refer to Jesus, we'll consider the one that is the clearest, a passage that probably dates to the 2nd century. It reads, "On the eve of the Passover, Yeshu was hanged. For 40 days before the execution took place, a herald went forth and cried, 'He is going forth to be stoned because he has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. Anyone who can say anything in his favor, let him come forward and plead on his behalf.' But since nothing was brought forward in his favor, he was hanged on the eve of Passover." First off, Yeshu is an Aramaic form of Jesus. And as I just said, Yeshu is mentioned several times throughout the Talmud in disparaging ways. So, what do we learn about Jesus from this passage? First, we learn that he was hanged on the week of Passover, which corroborates the Gospel's accounts. Also, I think it's reasonable to conclude that the word hanged is simply a variant expression of crucifixion. After all, we have two other New Testament texts that use this word to refer to the crucifixion. One is Luke 23:39, which says, "One of the criminals who were hanged railed at him." The other is Galatians 3:13, where Paul writes, "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, 'Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree.'" Third, according to the Talmud, we learn that Jewish leaders put out a warrant for Jesus' arrest ahead of time, asserting that Jesus would be stoned. And fourth, the Jews accused Jesus of practicing sorcery, an accusation that assumes Jesus was performing miracles and or exorcisms. Now, our fifth source is a Syrian philosopher named Marabar Serapion. This source dates to either the late 1st century or early 2nd century. Writing from prison, he wrote to his son, encouraging him to emulate some wise teachers from the past who had been unfairly treated. He writes, "For what advantage did the Athenians gain by the murder of Socrates, the recompense of which they received in famine and pestilence? Or the people of Samos by the burning of Pythagoras, because in 1 hour their country was entirely covered in sand? Or the Jews by the death of their wise king, because from that same time their kingdom was taken away? God justly avenged these 3 wise men. The Athenians died of hunger, the Samians were overwhelmed by the sea, the Jews, ruined and driven from their land, live in complete dispersion. But Socrates did not die for good. He lived on in the teaching of Plato. Pythagoras did not die for good. He lived on in the statue of Hera. Nor did the wise king die for good. He lived on in the teaching which he had given. While Serapion doesn't mention Jesus specifically by name, it's indisputable that he is talking about him in this letter. So what can we learn about Jesus from Mara bar Serapion? First, Jesus was considered to be a wise king. Recall Josephus had earlier called Jesus a wise man. And remember that Jesus was crucified by the Romans for being the king of the Jews. So this language does appear consistent with how non-Christians thought of Jesus. Second, Jesus was killed, just as the other two teachers, Socrates and Pythagoras, were. Third, we learn that judgment came upon the Jewish people after Jesus' death, which is most likely a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. And fourth, Jesus lives on in the teaching that he gave to his followers. And just as a quick aside, if this did come from a Christian source, it would have undoubtedly said something like Jesus lives on because he rose from the dead. Now, our sixth source is the 2nd century Greek writer Lucian of Samosata. In one of his writings, Lucian writes disparagingly of Christians. He sees Christianity as a cult that's filled with a bunch of gullible people, so gullible that they would follow the teachings of Jesus. He writes, "The Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with a general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion, which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment that they are converted, and deny the gods of Greece, and worship the crucified sage, and live after his laws. All this they take quite on faith, with the result that they despise all worldly goods alike, regarding them merely as common property." Here, Lucian provides us with a few important details about Jesus. First, that he is worshipped. Second, that he was a man. Recall that mythicists argue that Christians base their new religion off the mystery cults and legends of Greece and Rome. And thus, Christ was an invented figure like Hercules or Mithras. Yet, it's very clear here that Lucian believes that Jesus was a man of flesh and blood. Third, that Jesus was crucified. Fourth, the Christians' belief in immortality led them to forsake their earthly lives. Fifth, Jesus taught his followers that they were all brothers and sisters. This is consistent with Jesus' statement in Mark 3:34, "For whoever does the will of God, he is my brother and sister and mother." Sixth, Jesus was known as a crucified sage. Again, we see this common theme that Jesus was known as a wise teacher to outsiders. In this way, many people viewed Christianity not so much as a religion, but as a philosophy. Ancient religions were very much based upon cultic activities. Philosophies were based upon the teachings of a wise teacher. And in a way, Christianity was a combination of these two things. And seventh, because they took Jesus' teachings to heart, Christians shared their worldly goods with each other. Our seventh and final source we'll consider in this video is Suetonius. Suetonius was born in the year 69 and became the chief secretary of the emperor Hadrian. He was also a good friend of Pliny the Younger. He wrote biographies on the 12 Caesars, many of which were based upon his access to the imperial and senatorial archives, other public documents, and eyewitnesses. He also lived through the reign of many of the Caesars. In his life of Claudius, Suetonius briefly mentions Christ in passing, without giving much information on him. He writes, "Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome, who, instigated by Chrestus, continually caused unrest." Here, Suetonius is writing about the expulsion of all the Jews from Rome in the year 49. This event is also corroborated in Acts 18:2, which says, "And Paul found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to leave Rome." Now, Suetonius tells us that this expulsion was due to the instigation of Chrestus. Chrestus is most likely an alternative Latinized spelling of Christ. After all, Tacitus uses this variant spelling when referring to Christians, and Tertullian says that Christians are sometimes mispronounced as Christians. Here, it seems that Suetonius mistook Claudius's decree to mean that Chrestus himself was stirring up trouble in Rome. He obviously had very limited understanding of Christianity. But more likely, there were significant disputes that arose over Christ amongst the Jews in Rome in the late 40s that led to unrest. And this unrest made Claudius uncomfortable, which led him to expel all the Jews from the city. So, in summary, based upon these 7 non-Christian sources, we learn several facts about Jesus. They are: Jesus was a real person. Jesus had a brother named James who was stoned to death by the Jews. Jesus was considered a wise teacher. Jesus gathered followers. Jesus was known to be a miracle worker / sorcerer. Jesus was handed over to Roman authorities by Jewish leaders. Jesus was crucified during the reign of Tiberius by Pontius Pilate. Jesus was crucified during Passover week. The Jesus movement did not die out after his crucifixion. The Jesus movement began in Judea, but had quickly spread to regions like Rome and Bithynia. The Christians worshiped Jesus as if he were God. The early Christians followed the ethical teachings of Jesus. And the early Christians were persecuted for their commitment to Christ. In short, even without the New Testament, we still get a full description of who Jesus was from early non-Christian sources. It's very clear that none of these writers thought that Jesus was a myth or a made-up figure. They all believed that he was a real person who lived in the recent past. Now, certainly these sources aren't nearly as good as our New Testament documents, but they do corroborate much of the biblical account. Well, thanks so much for watching. Be sure to hit like and subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments below.